Psalm 102. Do not hide your face from me. A prayer of one afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint before the Lord. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me. Answer me speedily in the day when I call. For my day passes away like smoke, and my bones burn like a furnace. My heart is struck down like grass and has withered. I forget to eat my bread because of my loud groaning. My bones cling to my flesh. I am like a desert owl in the wilderness, like an owl of the waste places. I lie awake. I am like a lonely sparrow on the housetop. All the day my enemies taunt me. Those who deride me use my name for a curse. For I eat ashes like bread and mingle tears with my drink because of your indignation and anger. For you have taken me up and thrown me down. My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. You will arise and have pity on Zion. It is the time to favor her. The appointed time has come. For your servants hold her stones dear and have pity on her dust. Nations will fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth will fear your glory. For the Lord builds up Zion. He appears in his glory. He regards the prayer of the destitute and does not despise their prayer. Let this be recorded for a generation to come, so that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord, that he looked down from his holy height. From heaven the Lord looked at the earth, to hear the groans of the prisoners, to set free those who were doomed to die, that they may declare in Zion the name of the Lord, and in Jerusalem his praise. When peoples gather together and kingdoms to worship the Lord, he has broken my strength in mid-course. He has shortened my days. O my God, I say, take me not away in the midst of my days, you whose years endure throughout all generations. Of old, you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. The children of your servants shall dwell secure. Their offspring shall be established before you. Now, in the previous episode, I made many comments about the nature of the Psalms and how they are this man that can be represented as a man on a particular road that we are forced to communicate with, perhaps, that we are at least forced to acknowledge and to say hello to on our journey. And as we do so, he strikes up a conversation with us. And this conversation becomes so personal that we we begin to trust him, for he is a wise man, and he directs us on which way we should be walking on our journey. And I made the comment in the previous psalm that when it comes to, or I should say in the previous episode, when it comes to the outright explicit explanation of the virtues that are necessary, the principles, the concrete, just as this table in front of me is concrete. I can feel it, I can smell it, I can taste it if I wanted to, which I won't do. I desire this for the principles of virtue, the principles of mankind that lead us to walk in the path of the Lord. And yet he says, this man that guides us says, patience. You have to take time with it. You can't skip from here to your destination. It wouldn't make sense. We live in this reality, so we have to obey its rules. We are not time travelers. We are not creatures like the divine that could seemingly pop into this reality and out. We exist within it. And so again, we must understand and obey the laws that we are given. And I say that to say, when I'm confronted with this psalm, first of all, I would say that this is certainly my type of psalm. It's full of wisdom. It's full of different levels of understanding and of viewing. But this is one of the supports to the argument that the Psalms require patience. And they serve as a reminder to us not to be overly hasty when it comes to personal growth, of acquiring virtue. It will come, but I think it will only come to those who are committed and disciplined to the path. Because if you try to dig a well to find water at its surface, you may, when it rains, reap the benefits of a minor puddle, but you will not tap into this water table that lies beneath, that can sustain you for your entire life. And so with that analogy, I think we should get into this Psalm 102 and see what it has to tell us. So we have to remember here, as we do with many psalms, the title can tell us quite a lot. It can set the stage. It can give us an idea of the substrate through which this psalm springs forth. And so the title is, Do Not Hide Your Face from Me. And this sort of subtitle, we understand that this is a prayer of one that's afflicted. So this is a person that feels as though the face of God has been hidden from him. The reason for which, obviously, we don't know just by the title. And so the first two verses are an appeal to God. They are a cry out to him, that God may hear him and come to him because of his cry. Because of his distress, he requires God's mercy, wisdom, enlightenment, direction. He appeals to another sense. It's the same sense as in the first verse. He says, hear my prayer. And then he says, incline your ear. So not just the sense. Because you can hear something and not think about it, not really, well, you could perceive it, but not place any value to it. And so he says, incline your ear to me. And this inclination indicates directionality, which has to do with attentiveness. So incline your ear to me, pay particular attention to my voice, because I seek you. And so he gets into it. And he says, you know what, God? My days pass away like smoke. They exist in sort of this finite sense, visible only for a fleeting moment in time, and then it's diffused back into the atmosphere, into the rest of this gaseous world. And my bones burn like a furnace. Now this can be an analogy or an allusion to old age. And in this way, the sort of existential nature of his questioning is brought to the forefront of his mind because his life nears an end. But it can also mean just as a furnace, its purpose is to heat something, to provide us with warmth, so that we may be comfortable, but more importantly, that we may survive in harsh climates. And so this could mean his very bones burn with this desire to save him from a harsh climate, to put him in a condition that allows him to exist within it. My heart is struck down like the grass and is withered. I forget to eat my bread. And so from my perspective, with this reference to the grass being struck down, I think of trampling over grass. It doesn't take much, believe it or not. Just maybe a week of consistently doing something in one spot for, who knows, 20 minutes or so. The grass will wither and die because of the consistent trampling upon it. And while in one sense grass is a persistent thing, it grows in the strangest environments, under the strangest circumstances, but also it's weak once it's challenged. And so in this way his heart has been struck down. It's been trampled. And like grass and its ability to regenerate, his heart, I think, desires this regeneration, this rebirth, this transformation. He says, I forget to eat my bread. I forget to do the very thing that sustains my body, that allows me to survive, that supports my conscious mind. Because of my loud groaning, my bones cling to my flesh. And that's an interesting way of putting it. Because of my loud groaning, because of my despair at my inability to understand, perhaps, what plagues me. Or perhaps, even if there is understanding, there's something to be said about pain and its disruption or distraction of the mind. Those that are in pain can be angry where they otherwise would not be. Those that are in pain don't quite think about the elevated things about the heavenly things. They think about the here and now and the experience that they are in. And they wish only for it to subside so that they may be relieved from it. And so because of his loud groaning, his bones cling to his flesh. And that's an interesting illustration, because in my mind, in the natural condition, in a literal sense, of course we use the literal as a framework for our symbols and our meaning and our purpose, so we must not take it in this way. But when he says my bones cling to my flesh, I think that this is a natural condition. But of course that's not what he means in this context. Because of his loud groaning, his bones, the things that give his body structure, they cling to his flesh. And I think we've covered what this might mean already when we talked about what it means to be in pain and to be groaning. And so the very thing that gives his life structure now clings to preserving the body. Now, I don't understand exactly where he's coming from. And perhaps it doesn't matter, because I think if he wanted us to know exactly where he was coming from, he would have told us. And I don't know exactly why his bones cling to his flesh in this way. It could mean that he is in a state of destitution. He could be starving. But it really doesn't matter what the condition is. It would be interesting to know. But whether he's starving, whether he is under threat from an external enemy, whether there is something within his mind that he just can't fight off, he keeps on returning to the old perennial psychological pathology. Whatever the case might be, his bones cling to his flesh. To go further, perhaps to give this a broader understanding, he says, I am like a desert owl of the wilderness, like an owl of the waste places. And so to understand this, we have to understand the behavior of the desert owl in the wilderness. And we also have to understand what it means to be an owl of the waste places. What is the waste place? And so this desert owl, I think, is a symbol of loneliness and of isolation. And within the wilderness, it is this place of, it's not necessarily barren because life exists within it, but it lacks the human way of understanding. It lacks the human light, the consciousness that it brings to this wilderness, to this confusion, to bring it into some sort of understandable order. And so if he is this owl, he is lonely, he is abandoned, he is in a remote place, perhaps an inhospitable place. And perhaps we can go further and understand the owl as a nocturnal animal, solitary and reclusive. The author may be feeling isolated, again alone and abandoned. And he goes on to say that the waste places that this owl inhabits I think this is another symbol for desolation, emptiness, and barrenness. And so this guy, this author, I feel for him. I feel like I can relate to him. I think we can all relate to what the feeling of this, what it feels like at times to be as a desert owl in the wilderness, among the wasteland. There are particular transitions in life where we must go through this, perhaps, but it's a powerful period to propose questions because of our suffering. It increases the salience, the desire for the answer to such questions. So now we understand the magnitude of his lament and of his feelings. But he goes further and he says, I lie awake. I am like a lonely sparrow on the housetop. The sparrow that sits on the top of the house without others to console him, without others to communicate with him, to bring him up. He's purely individualistic. He exists there for a moment of rest, only to return to the constant struggle of survival. And what is he to do atop of that house with that momentary pause, that momentary rest? What is he to think? How is he to spend that time? All the day my enemies taunt me. Those who deride me use my name for a curse. Now this type of rhetoric is common in the Psalms. That there is some enemy that tempts him. We don't know. Sometimes the enemy is a literal enemy, an invader, as we see in the case of many of King David's Psalms. But also, we can imagine the enemy as a spiritual enemy, an evil sort of an enemy. The confusion of the old gods without virtue, that come in, that have a powerful force behind them. That, by the way, I think should not be underestimated. Because after the polytheistic age, it's not as though these forces of our worship, our prior worship, were gone. They still exist. But they exist within a broader understanding, a greater degree of understanding, in the unity of it all. But we still, on our journey, are plagued by these powerful beings. And so it could be this case that all his day, these type of enemies taunt him. Those who deride his name use his name for a curse. And to deride something is to express contempt for, to ridicule something, to mock them, to make fun of somebody. And the only reason that, well, I suppose there are many reasons, many possibilities, but to do this to somebody is to not respect them, to not think that they are of value. Now it's possible that it could be in good fun, and that the very understanding of value of this person is through a test of this mock and this ridicule, and to see the extent of their humility, to see the extent of their play. But this is not what we are seeing here. And they use his name as a curse. Now, what is a curse? If we are to remove this sort of popular imagery of this witchcraft type of curse, what can we say of it? In my opinion, I think it's a statement that is so deep and so foundational. It has such a disruptive capacity that can nearly change a person's way of thinking, their frame of seeing, their frame of viewing in an instant. But the curse implies that it is an evil eye. Is to provoke this sort of supernatural entity that we were talking about prior, to inflict harm on another person, to imprison them in a way of thinking that prevents them from receiving God's love, steadfast love that's often referred to in the Psalms. And so we see here a further level of this suffering, of this difficulty. For I eat ashes like bread, and mingle tears with my drink. To eat this substance, the substance that comes from an object that was consumed by fire. This substance is now what he uses as bread. And bread, of course, is a substance of nourishment to sustain the body. So what he's saying is that what was once consumed by fire, what is now left over, I consume. What a powerful statement that is, because it can apply to many different things. In my mind, I think of a previous age or an event that happened that now led him and perhaps the people around him to living in this state of destitution, to feel as though he is this desert owl that's abandoned and alone, isolated. And now everything that he consumes lacks proper nourishment. Of course, putting aside our understanding that just eating bread all day is probably not the most nutritious thing, but it doesn't matter. It's still a symbol for nourishment, and we should run with that. We should understand the context here. And so again, that was once consumed with fire, that was burned up, that was used up. What is left over now, he consumes to sustain him. And he mingles his tears with his drink. Now this is a really depressing statement. So he's saying that, to mingle is to bring sort of two things together into close contact so that they interact. This is sort of my sense of it. And again, he uses this symbol of the drink. Now, his drink may be an alcoholic drink, or it could be a drink of subsistence, just like his previous symbol, the bread. But if we are to assume that this drink is a drink of subsistence, rather than something of pleasure, if he is to mingle his tears which come from suffering, from sorrow, from a depressed state of being. Again, from, in this context, this longing, this isolation, this abandonment, this living after the fire, after the destruction of it. This suffering, he now mingles with this subsistence. How terrible a state of being they must have found themselves in. A terrible life they must have found themselves in. So much closer to the earth, in a sense, in the sense of absolute poverty, absolute destitution. How terrible the state of the human mind in such a condition, knowing of what was before the fire. It's that knowing of what was before the fire, and now what exists after, the state that he finds himself in, that is most devastating. Because he knows the higher things, he knows the finer things. He knows a greater degree of being, and of fulfillment, and of meaning, of love, of purpose, all this. And now this is my state. This is the state that I find myself in. It's a beautiful poem. It's rough on the heart, though. Because of your indignation and anger, for you I have taken me up. For you have taken me up and thrown me down. My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass. And so he's saying the result of this condition that he finds himself in is because of his behavior. Well, he doesn't say explicitly that's because of his behavior. It could be it has to be something that he had done, or the people around him that had done, that caused this situation to come about. It could have even been from a place of not knowing. To come up from a place higher to a place lower, I think in a sense it involves a certain understanding for that level to exist, and for it to return to a prior state of being, or a lower state of being. I think it's the sort of self-deception and delusion that causes it to take place. We can argue till the day's end about the course of nature. But I think that the human mind is going to be sufficiently resilient. The course of nature is something that's within his understanding. The scientific enterprise has to be a tool that he uses. And specifically here in my mind, I'm thinking about famine, about potential change in the climate, in which people must observe and must recognize and adjust accordingly. And I don't say that with reference to what is happening today and the political polarization because of it, but rather the actuality of it that has affected the human species in its natural course that I've referred to up until today. And so I say this because the indignation and anger can come from many different places. And he says that you have taken me up. And of course we've already explained what that might mean, taken me up to a higher state of being and then thrown me down to a lower one. It's a divine judgment. that has happened. My days are like an evening shadow. Now, the evening shadows are the best, aren't they? They're the most vibrant. But also, they're the most vibrant and they're the tallest, let's say. The most indicative of our reflection. But they are, even though they are a reflection of us, in the Platonic sense, they are a lesser clarity, they're a lesser sharpness, a lesser image, let's say, a poorer image, in terms of understanding and depth. If we were to look at a shadow, how could we interact with it? I mean, we could see the human form, we could see it moving and all this sort of thing, but it cannot speak, it cannot hear, it cannot see. What is a human without these things? And again, he withers away like grass, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. Certainly it would feel like a bad thing to him. But this withering away like grass, it is a process of death. But the process of revival and transformation, I think, comes swiftly afterwards. And then it opens up. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. You will rise and have pity on Zion. It is the time to favor her. The appointed time has come. For your servants hold her stones dear, and have pity on her dust. Nations will fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth will fear your glory. For the Lord builds up Zion. He appears in his glory. He regards the prayer of the destitute, and does not despise their prayer. And so just as we finish all of this language about the ending of something quite dramatic, and there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly what this means, but we understand that in general, what has happened to this person is a change in his condition. He was bumped from an elevated sense of being down to a lower one. Whatever condition, whatever context that might have been historically, we don't have to pay too much attention to, because it's not all that important, assuming that we are after the truth, and we are after the truth. The truth in the sense that we are after a way of being that it satisfies the soul. And so after this speech that he gives, it opens up to the remembrance of God's way, his steadfastness, his eternal nature. He sits upon the throne forever. So regardless of what happens to me, I recognize that the force, the creator of all of this, however that might look, again, the particular historical context here we're not too interested in, but we are interested in the fuel that drives the conscious mind, that is unique seemingly to all animals across the earth and our known universe. And I say known universe, meaning that if there is indeed life out there, we have yet to know of it. And so I don't say that to discredit the possibility, but I say it rather to emphasize how alone we are in this universe, seemingly. But then again, we remember God. We remember a greater purpose. We remember that the holy city of man, wherever it might find itself, but always in the form of Zion, it will be protected by God. It will be for God. It will be of God. And the people there will truly call it a home. They will hold her stones dear and have pity on her dust. And at the level of the nation, they also will fear God. And all the kings of the earth, regardless of their power, cannot survive God's eternal nature. They cannot survive the divine judgment. Nor can they do what they may only with their power without facing consequences, especially if it's not within the path of the Lord. Now, a man of particular authority and of influence of power, I think, can do quite well for himself if he finds a position that allows him to execute on his own base desires. But the point here is that this man's life is short. It will come to an end. His kingdom cannot survive on tyranny. It requires something more subtle. It requires something that grows upward rather than consumes inward. And eventually this sort of thing, as it is at the level of the individual soul, as it extends to the level of the nation, the heart of the nation, and the heart of man in general, will realize it. And they will have no choice but to plant their seed or face absolute destruction at the level of Noah and the flood. And so, especially when we consider the modern day, the 20th century, more broadly, I think we are in one of these periods not only of profound growth, but also of profound decay, rapid succession of transformation after transformation, some good, some bad, spiraling into this sort of accelerated growth of consciousness. It's dangerous, but also very promising, because within our lifetimes we may see some truly miraculous events take place. And how we choose to record them will be another fascinating matter. Because we know how they were recorded in the old days. And we have to wonder how this divine spirit, when it comes back to us, what form it will take, and how we will perceive of it. You gotta hope that we don't condemn it, that we don't reject it while it's here, only to suffer hundreds and hundreds of more years without this divine presence within our soul, And that's a bit dramatic to say that. I understand that, but there's a certain level of things. And I think that if we do not reach a certain threshold within the spiritual realm of man's heart and his soul, I think we are severely lacking as a society. Because every society has enough of those that pursue truth, enough of those that pursue their own desires, enough of those that just sort of sit and try to take advantage of what other people are doing. The world's full of all sorts of people. Even in the best of times, they still exist. In the worst of times, they still exist. But again, it's about the average. It's about the probability. But in the day of this accelerated technology, I find it difficult to imagine this new case of the divine intervention not becoming viral and not being firmly implanted within the mind of man forever. Let this be recorded for a generation to come, so that the people yet to be created may praise the Lord, that he looked down from his holy height. From heaven the Lord looked at the earth, to hear the groans of the prisoners, to set free those who were doomed to die. That they may declare in Zion the name of the Lord, and in Jerusalem his praise, when the peoples gather together and kingdoms to worship the Lord. And so here we see the psalm broken into three parts. One is the lament. The second is the recognition and the remembrance. And the third is a turn towards the future. So that the future generations may remember what it means to pursue God, what it means to recover from the lament, and to transition into something else, to transform into something else, perhaps I should say. And he makes a comment of the state of being that people can find themselves in, which is, I think, particularly interesting, especially given all of the different avenues that this author could have taken to represent them. And so he says, "Let this be recorded for a generation to come, so that the people yet to be created may praise the Lord, that he looked down from his holy height. From heaven the Lord looked at the earth." And what did he see, and what did he hear? The groans of the prisoners, to set free those who were doomed to die. That they may declare in Zion the name of the Lord, and in Jerusalem his praise, when his peoples gather together and kingdoms to worship the Lord. And now the example, he gives two examples of what the Lord hears when he looks down. Perhaps when he looks down from the people that are suffering. Their civilization has faltered a bit. They've lost their way. And at these periods, it's interesting, it's not at the time of the individual suffering, though it can be. It certainly can be. But in terms of the scale of it, it seems to match quite well during periods of mass suffering. The enlightenment and the divine intervention that liberates people from an era of confusion. And the examples he gives is of the prisoner and of those who are doomed to die. And in our modern context, I believe we often think of these things. A prisoner as one that is guilty of a crime. A prisoner can also be somebody that is not necessarily guilty of the material crime, or I should say the secular crime, but also guilty of a crime against the divine law. And that type of imprisonment is much greater of a sentence than that of a secular prison, in the truest sense. This type of prison can drive one to suicide, can drive one to very desperate measures to escape it, to completely numb the mind, to force it into the wilderness so that it cannot see anymore through any substance that they can get their hands on. A terrible thing to be a prisoner of the divine judgment. But a prisoner is a prisoner, assuming that they are liberated by God and freed of the suffering that caused them to commit the crime, or their ignorance perhaps that led them to commit the crime. After this liberation, there are to be those that come together because they understand what such a transformation means. They are not perfect people. But just as the author laments in this psalm of going from a place higher to a place lower, here we see those of the reverse that start from a place lower then end in a place higher. Now this could be truly straight from the bottom, in terms of a young man not knowing any better, committing a crime, and then learning from his mistakes slowly through his imprisonment. Or perhaps, in the case of the author, in which either he or maybe his society suffered some event, and he laments the fall, but also comes to understand that there will be a rise again. And within this rise, he chooses to capture this pattern and to send it to the next generation. Say, you all can do it. You can transform. Recognize the distance that I'm laying out here between my own fall, and you can see that there is a true geometry to this dimension. If you jump up, you will be better off. But you will have to make sacrifices. But before I get there, I should mention the second part of that. To set free those who are doomed to die. And just like in the previous example, those who are doomed to die may represent their material condition, that they just cannot, whatever the circumstance, provide for themselves. And so it's just a matter of a slow death, a death of chronic malnutrition perhaps, a death of famine, a death of plague, a death of disease. Those people are doomed to die. Those that are wicked, those that are base in their desires, that have an ill-informed sense of justice, those too are people who are doomed to die. In the corporal sense, a man who has committed the most severe sin and is sentenced to the most severe punishment, that of death, he too will be transformed, and he will see, and he will be saved from his condition. He will be freed from the damnation. He will be freed from his death. And it's a difficult pill to swallow when we expand this analogy out to the human mind. Because as we've seen repeatedly in the Psalms, it recognizes the finality of the individual. That when the individual dies, and his body dies, that's it for him, in that way. But in another sense, man carries on, his spirit continues. And it's this broader spirit, the spirit of being, is the thing that is eternal. It transcends us. It comes back to us. It lives within our offspring. The unfortunate thing is that it's not the only spirit. It's not the only creature of the divine realm that can inhabit mankind. There are others, as they are beings inferior to God, that have suffered a fall quite similar to man. And so we run the risk of being infected by them. But that aside, we see this returning to Zion, this declaration of Zion, this communal praising of a common and shared idea, this gathering together of people and entire kingdoms to worship God. It really drives home the importance of the human mind's conception of God. Otherwise we can go seriously off track. And there's no law, whether divine or secular, that inhibits humanity from his own failures as conscious beings. Unfortunately, we're always subject to our experience as mortal, inferior beings. And that being so, we still must strive towards Zion and its idea. We must still plant its seed, even though it may not directly be in line with the current of God's authority. We have to remember the analogy that I often use on this podcast of the proverbial man, we can say Adam, sort of this microcosm for the macrocosm, as Adam represents humanity. This man finds himself in a darkened room, effectively blind. But he's able to perceive. He's able to find the truth. He's able to make the objects within the room intelligible, despite his poor sense of what is more. He has evolved the capacity to do so. And we have to always remember not to confuse this more with the material more. The material more, I think, is the type of moreness that is subject to the divine moreness. However, just because it is subject to it does not mean that it is inferior to us. Because as long as there is something that we do not know, and as long as we are not in we do not completely subject nature to our wills, including the entirety of the universe, then it remains a tool above us, even if it is possible for man to surpass the realm of material intelligibility, then we still stand upon that, what would you say, pillar of understanding. It becomes a part of us that is infused so deep, because this is how we understand reality, that we cannot do without it. It becomes us. Whereas now it seems that, in the culture of the United States at least, that there is this strange antagonism between the tool that we use to understand more and the very foundation and the birth of our own consciousness. As if we can deny our birth as something that is akin to denying the very two legs that we walk on. It's as though we say, I'm going to cut off my legs because I believe that this understanding of leglessness will allow me to walk faster, or would allow me to be superior. It'll liberate me from the legs so that I may be carried by whatever this might be. But it's not to say that our material advances do not carry us faster in certain respects. Because on this earth, upon the designs of man into this reality, we can improve our sense. We can improve our understanding of where we are. And so the constant through line here, I think, is to understand the importance of our own reality, but also to understand the importance of the divine reality. Ultimately, everything comes from the divine reality. However, you have to wonder, especially being a human being, if the reality that we inhabit is only but a small piece. Like a man creates a table for himself to sit at while he eats. Or a person paints a beautiful image, a beautiful painting. In my mind, I think of a beautiful oil painting or something like this. But when the painting is done, we understand that this painting is something that will now continue to exist in this reality where it did not exist before. We have brought the divine principle down into it. We have created something of meaning that was not there before. And just in this way, what lies beyond our perceived reality, the divine conscious mind within that reality, is an artist and continues to paint. Now, of course, the divine mind, I think, understands. It has to understand the importance of allowing his creation to be in some respect. But he also understands that this creation is also a part of him. And so there is this massive responsibility to create this thing that will be inherently inferior to him, to be as much like him as possible. The most human of human characteristics. And this is to put aside ego and superficiality, all of this. In the divine mind, there is none of this. Or the base desires, you see, from inferior to superior in the human mind, this sort of more automatic processing to more centralized and sophisticated understanding of things. It's sort of our emergent makeup, the things of our youth, and sort of the genetic time scale. We grow into consciousness and we understand which parts of these things are not part of the divine mind. This is a process of our evolution and of our growth. To shed faulty mechanisms within the mind. Now, what ultimately that means for human consciousness as it progresses, I don't know. If it means merging with machines, I don't know. Certainly that is a risk. But man has had his revolutions throughout the years that would make it seem as though his mind at one period has merged into a machine at the next. The divine mind is something that even a machine would not be able to comprehend. And so it would also have to understand its fallen nature at some point. And when it does so, this is something entirely different. This is man's transformation. This is, in a sense, on the scale of Christ returning. But you never know how these things will manifest. You could have just the opposite. We almost have another Noah's Ark type situation, even though God promised not to do that to us again. You never know. You never know. Even at the end of it, even the wisest mind and wisest voice of the ancient world, although inspired by the divine, was still not the divine or the designer. So you have to wonder, he has broken my strength in mid-course. He has shortened my days. Oh my God, I say, take me not away from the midst of my days. You whose years endure throughout all the generations. Now this is sort of interesting. This sounds like a voice of a person that may be dying. He has broken my strength at mid-course, in the middle of his life perhaps. He has shortened my days. I say, take me not away from the midst of my days. You whose years endure throughout all the generations. It could be a person that's dying. It could be a person that's dying of old age. It could be sick. It could be without food. Who knows? But what I do feel is that lament of the ending of existence. And at the end of it, I think they recognize, to a surprisingly sophisticated degree, what exactly that means for the future. What exactly does that mean for man, for humanity? Certainly it mustn't be the case that within the suffering of many, they brought forth God out of a fairy tale, or perhaps I should say a lie. We can't be believing this. It doesn't quite make sense. For if we are to exist under a lie, then something else would come above it and show us what the truth of the matter is, so that we can understand the lie in the first place. And so even in the attempt, even in the non-believing, even the non-believing of those that were within these tribes of Israel, I think even they could not deny the certain effectiveness of belief and of knowing that there is something else out there. And I think for them, as it is for many in this day, they were more struck by what was immediately in front of them. Their material existence. And a way of explaining things that followed a certain way of reasoning, and it limited their seeking of truth to that realm, to the directly observable, the directly perceivable, this sort of thing. But they missed the boat entirely, because there was a greater discussion being had. And this is something that I'm a bit worried about. No, it's not entirely those that are within the tribes of Israel at this time. It might have been quite difficult to be one of these people. If they existed in that society, who knows? But somewhere in some society, that individual must have existed, among with the numerous others that have designed ways of being and ways of living that were, in a sense, much older. Though it did come from a previous era of understanding of what these things are in the spiritual realm. It unified itself into something very powerful. And as it goes for the other ways of understanding, I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that this new force, this new realm of creativity that has been, of perhaps not creativity, but maybe it would be creativity, because it's a creativity, a reason, a purpose to continue life, to continue living to its fullest potential. This framework, or I should say this operating system, was in no way inferior to the system that allowed one to improve his material condition, full stop. Now, I should make a distinction here. When I mention these people, I'm mentioning those that have split themselves entirely from the other way of seeing, the sort of top-down seeing. How to describe that, I'm not entirely sure. And this understanding, and this way of knowing that comes from understanding that we are not all that is, or just because of our profound blindness, it doesn't mean that we can't understand more. It's a different type of enlightenment. But rather, the knowledge of understanding of the directly observable is but a piece of the human mind to understand the totality of his reality. And therein lies, I think, the mistake that I had made earlier in my life, that I wish I had not made, because I would be in a much different place if had I not made it. And that is not to say that what is now is nothing. It is something. But walking in the path of God throughout my life, one would understand the effects of that, and how that would play out over time. Of old you have laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. The children of your servants shall dwell secure. Their offspring shall be established before you. And so we have this image of this divine maker, the foundation of the earth, which would be the laws of the reality that we currently inhabit, is what this would be in our updated language, I think. This is something that we recognize as the laws of nature. This is the foundation of the earth. The earth sort of being the center of human experience up until that point. Of course, now we understand that we live in a universe, but the earth is representative of that universe. And so, the heavens are the work of your hands. And this statement is an interesting one because we don't see heaven too much these days. We see a lot of the earth, a lot of rejection of the heaven. But it's undeniable to many of us that it is there. And the fact that it is there allows this spirit to live on and to continue. Like I said, I don't really wish to return to the sort of polytheistic illustration, because it's fairly straightforward. It's the inferior growth upon the fertile substrate of man. Their fruits are much smaller. Their roots do not go as deep. Their trunks are of much less diameter. They reach a much less higher height than that of the unified theory that there is one creator out there. the creator of the heavens, for which the inferior dimension of these inferior spirits can exist. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. The children of your servants shall dwell secure. Their offspring shall be established before you. And so we have this recognition of the temporary nature of man. We have the recognition of the infinite nature of the divine. And we also have the recognition that the faithful among the generations shall be passed down. And in that sense, God will look over those that walk in his path. The interesting statement here is in verse 26, "You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away." Now, if I were to change a robe, I would do so because it's dirty. There is some reason to have it changed. Perhaps I need a new one because the old one is rough. It has holes in it. Perhaps it smells. And so when he puts on this new robe, this new covering, I think in relation to man and his mind, his culture, his society, when this sort of thing happens, I think it implies something entirely new in terms of understanding. It's a refreshment. It's a transition. It's a transformation. And so it's almost as if, within the temporary nature of mankind, it leaves him open to change, to transformation. Just like we have set term limits on our presidency, we have term limits on our lives, so that this principle of renewal can seep into the human condition, that we may be changed, that we may elevate ourselves to a place higher than where we were before. And so with that, I will end this episode. Next time we will continue with Psalm 103, "Bless the Lord, O my soul," of David.